Morning, this is Dale Fye, and I am we'll call it the chairman of the Access Users Group Eastern Time Group. And this morning we're going to be joined by Anders Ebro. He is going to discuss building a secure access and SQL Server solution. Anders, if you would please take over.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you for having me. Hi, welcome everyone. As Dale said, my name is Anders Ebro, and my topic for today is going to be about building a secure access and SQL Server solution. Before we get started, I just wanted to try to get a quick feel of the room and hear how familiar people are with SQL Server. And I was doing this in Teams the other day, and we could do a quick show of hands by using the Teams raise a hand feature. But here I'm just going to have to ask people to call out and say, how many here are familiar with SQL Server and use it like every day?
I have a couple clients that have SQL Server backends, so I use it pretty much every day.
Okay. So since we can't do a show up, yeah, go ahead.
I'm using it rather regularly, but only since 2000. Not very long, so just 20 years now.
Okay. Excellent. So, well, SQL Server security can be really complex, and 1 hour is not nearly enough to cover all of SQL Server security. So my initial trial run for this presentation was 3 hours, and I've had to cut out a lot of topics and slides and just be quite selective about what I have time to cover. So with that in mind, the focus for today is going to be on setting up permissions for users that are connecting to SQL Server using AD authentication, Windows authentication. And we're going to focus on the cases where they are a member of an AD group. And I'm going to show how to set up custom database roles and assign security permissions to that role on different objects. I will not be covering SQL Server authentication where you connect with a user name and a password. Now, security, as I said, can be really complex, and one aspect of security that is difficult is that we might think we have built this super strong system and everything is really great, and it might be that the gate we built was indestructible, but have we made sure that we've covered all access roads to our server? Or it might be that we have security that turns out to really be nothing but a waste of time, like when you have a database password in Access that everyone knows. And the truth is that really secure applications can be time consuming to build, and a lot of Access applications are built on budget. And there's no doubt about it, but I think we can come a long way even on a limited budget, especially if we know what we're doing. And this is kind of a session to give you a sense of what can be done quite easily with SQL Server. But before we dive into all of the techie stuff, I just want to briefly share a bit of my background so that you know a little about me and also something about the experience me and my team have with doing complicated security setups. I'm a principal consultant. I've been with this company called Exacto for 5 years. We're based out of Denmark. We have 18 employees, and we recently opened up 2 new branches in Germany, trying to start gathering work there. I've been a full-time Access and SQL Server developer for 12 years. 9 of those years I've been using SQL Server. And these last few years we've kind of expanded into doing Excel and SQL interfaces instead of just Access and SQL. A couple of years ago, 2016, we started a Access, Excel, and SQL-based incentives tool to handle performance review and bonus payout at a big financial institution. We have data in that application on 25,000 employees. We have about 800 users that are managers. We have about 100 local administrators that log into the system. And we have on top of that 15 super admins. We have 3 different roles that we all need to assign permissions to. There's a lot of money being assigned each year through the use of this tool. So we want to make sure that the right people are assigning the money and that we can track who did it. We also want to make sure, since we have salary data in the system, that only the right people are actually seeing it. So not every solution we built needs to be super secure, but I will say that every time we make a solution, we have to at least consider what the security aspect of it is going to be. And with SQL Server, databases can have rights granted at the database level, such as DB data reader or DB data writer, which I'll return to. But in the following examples, I'm going to assume we need a bit more granular approach to what our users can do. But what are some good reasons for wanting more security? It could be that we want to ensure that access to our sensitive data is limited, or we want to ensure that users can only update data according to what their role is. And we want to limit what can happen in case of an account being hacked. I mean, it's fine that we say, this person we trust completely, she's not going to mess up the system, but what if her account gets hacked? If we've made sure to only give her the minimum amount of permissions that she needs to do her job, then we minimize the risk that can occur if she gets hacked. I've seen cases where we come in and take over a system and find out that all of the users were assigned database owner permissions on the database, which means they can basically do anything because the original developers or IT didn't bother setting up security correctly. And since we're speaking on sensitive data, I will say one rule about security that I like to repeat is that if you don't need the data, don't store it. If you don't need to store the credit card information, then don't store it. There's plenty of also third-party providers that can assist with storing data, and you can leave that area of responsibility to them. I want to talk about what I call application security versus SQL Server security. And with application security, I mean the type of application where all of the security logic is defined within our Access front end. And by SQL Server security, I mean cases where all of the rules are defined directly on SQL Server. So I want to start off with this short demo of how we as Access developers often see security implemented and why that can be inadequate in some cases. So let's say we have this really secure Access application. Let's just start it up over here and move it to the left. So let's say we have this Access application where we've disabled the shift bypass, we've disabled the navigation pane, shortcut keys, we might even have compiled it to ACCDE. And we've made sure that these controls are locked. We might even have some code that makes sure that these controls are locked. We don't want users to edit them. And I can't click. I'm clicking in all of this and nothing happens. Now let's say I launch up a second Access application. My system is really slow today. So I now have my second Access application. I'll move that to the right. Now what this application does is really quite simple. It connects to the first running Access application it finds and gathers information on that. So it picked up my Access application over here, picked up the file name, and it goes on to, the folder names are, it says what's the active form, it's the user administration form, and what are the controls on that form. So even though the form over here is locked and I can't do anything about it, I can just use this application form I have here. And I'll go say this checkbox is administrator. I want to give that a new value. I want to change that to 0. And notice that it changed over here. Or I want to, return it to being true. I want to give this person admin privileges. I'll click update. Once again, notice how it turns to true over here. So I can remote control the application over here and overrule any of those fancy rules that you as a developer set up in the front end. Because the user has permissions on the tables, which is the way it is with Access. I could even go ahead and run some malicious code and do an insert into the user table with my own credentials and run this query. I've already run it during my last demo session, so it's already here on my login. So what is it that makes Access so different? You have direct user access to the tables. By comparison, when your web browser is talking to a website, then it's the website's code that's going to send SQL statements off to the SQL Server, and it's the website that has the permissions to talk to the SQL Server. The user itself doesn't have permission to talk to the SQL Server. The user doesn't interact directly with SQL Server, only through the website, which is why websites talk a lot about SQL Server injection attacks. which we don't even, I mean, we could protect against that, but as I just showed you, there are other ways that are far easier than trying to do injection attacks. As I said, they don't even need fancy hacking. The code I have, you might think it's a lot of really complicated code, but really it's just like 10 or 20 lines of code. Couple of codes to get the application. If I just want to run it, it's really simple code here as well. Just use that application I connected to, use the current DB there, and execute my code. I won't spend any more time on this. I'd rather proceed. Another thing is, if we're using Windows authentication, then the user could just, open up SQL Server Management Studio and do the same if you have permissions on the table. That is one of the downsides of Windows authentication, is that the user can connect to SQL Management Studio. So, security components. Some of the things that we need to do to set up SQL Server security for users is that first, at the server level, we need to define a login. Then this means they can log into the server, but we want to grant them now permission on a single database. So at the database level, we must define a user account, which is then tied to a single login, the login we just created. And we can then proceed to define permissions such as select, insert, update, delete, or execute, or grant them role membership on the user account we created. And I've put a note down here that there's such a thing called contained databases, where the login and the user account are both defined at the database level, which can be really good if you have an Azure SQL Server and you don't want to have people have logins, and it also makes it easier to move your database from one server to another server. Okay, so let's imagine a scenario where we have a lot of users. And for this example, we'll just call them Billy Badger and John Johnson. They're both members of the AD group salespeople. So let's give a look at how this login stuff could work. Let's say we go ahead and create a login. So I'm on my server. I hit F5, execute this, create a login. And this is at the server level, so I don't have to worry about where I'm standing. I'll go ahead and now create a database user. I have to do this in the database. This database is called Seattle because I've given this presentation in Seattle before. So I use the database, and then I say I want to create a user from that login. There we go. And I want to grant permissions. I'll come back to all of the details of this, but for now, I'll just say I'll select an update, or I can, here I've granted one permission per line, but I could also grant multiple permissions at the same time. But if I have hundreds of users and hundreds of objects, I don't really want to handle permissions on a user-by-user level. So I'll go ahead and drop my user again, and drop my login once more. What if we instead take advantage of the fact that both of our users, or all of our users, might be members of an AD group? So what I can do is I can create a login. One second. Seems I forgot to run my reset script before the demo started. There we go. So I'll go ahead and create the login for the AD group called salespeople. And once again, using Seattle, I will create a user for that group. Now I don't have to call the user the same thing as the AD group is called. You could argue that it's good practice, and I do think a lot of people do that, but I just wanted to illustrate that you don't actually have to call them the same. So does this mean now that both Billy Badger and John Johnson is going to come in and be identified as sales person? Because I want to be able to identify which of the two it is that is doing stuff on my server. So this is where we can use the system user to return the Windows user account. You can see in my case, it returns my Azure AD, Ebro, which is the AD account I'm using. Let's see what it would look like if we are John Johnson. We can fake being another user on SQL Server if we have the impersonate permissions, which I do on this. This is my local server. So I'll execute as this user. And we can see when I do the select user that it's not returning salesperson. It is returning my AD user and not the database user. Once I'm done playing around with being John Johnson, I can do a revert, which means I'm now back to being myself again. So all members of the salespeople group will now have access to our database, which means that they can connect to our database, but they don't yet have any table or view rights. So let's go back to our presentation. So with this setup, we don't need to create permissions per user, but we can just say if they're a member of that AD group, then they have permissions on the server. So if we're looking at a really low budget solution, we might just go ahead from this point and use the two built-in database roles called DB Data Reader, which gives you full read access on all objects in the database, or DB Data Writer, which gives you full write access on all tables or views in the database. And once if you use this DB Data Reader and DB Data Writer, then what you have is pretty similar to what we have in Access, where if you have your permission on the folder, you can write to the backend database. And as I said, if this is a low budget solution, then this is still an easy way to do it, and you still get the benefit of SQL Server backup and SQL Server much better at handling when the connection is bad. But in most cases, with just a tiny bit of more work, we can start to get much better control over what our users can and can't do at the server level, or database level. And this is where the custom user roles come into play. Let's have a quick look at that. So once again, using Seattle, as I said, I could go ahead and do the data reader, data writer by adding members. So the way it works is I alter the role and add the member, or I could go into Seattle security roles, database roles, data reader, and add the users there. I personally prefer to use the use SQL for it because it makes it much easier to copy and paste my scripts than doing it through the interface. But instead of using the built-in database roles, the one that are prefixed down here with DB, we could also create our own role. So I want to make my own role, which I'll call role sales, and I want to assign the salesperson user to that role sales. I'll execute this. And now I'll start saying that this role will get some permissions. So I'll say that this role has the permission to select from sales, or I could go ahead at the very broad level and say, I'll grant you select on the entire schema. So every table or view that is in the DBO schema, the user will have select permissions for. This is kind of similar to DB Data Reader, except it's on a schema by schema level. So you could say that if you want to have just a couple of let's say, admin tables, you could put them in an admin schema, and then you could separate the two areas from each other. That's one way of doing it, and then say, well, we have one role that has permissions on the DBO schema, and then another role that will have more extended permissions by also having permissions on the admin schema. So testing is, of course, key, because how can we fake being another user? Because if I'm testing it from my user account, and my user account is database owner, so I can select anything from the database. And I want to make sure that when the user gets my app, it looks good for him as well. So within SQL Server, as I showed you, we can use the execute as, and I think it's fine for testing a bit of on-server stuff, but I really want to test how it works from my application side of things. And Windows has this program called Runas, and we can use this to execute under a different security context. And the syntax, which I like to place in a simple shortcut file, is I have the path of the Runas executable. I pass in the user that I want to experiment with. I tell it to call my access executable. And finally, I give it the path of the access application that I want to run. So let's see how that works. So down here, up here, I have my simple shortcut file. I'll just quickly go into properties. And this is the same string I just showed you on the screen, except it's kind of difficult to read because you can't expand this text box. But I'll execute it now. And it comes up with this prompt where I have to type in the password for the user. So I can't just, fake being a user and not have their password. So I'll type the password, and it doesn't show up on screen. So don't be surprised when it doesn't show up. And I'll hit enter and start up my Access application. I don't know if it's WebEx that is being slow or if my machine is upgrading Windows in the background or something. It's incredibly slow today. Anyways, within my Access application, I have my table sales, which is a linked table to my SQL Server. And let's see if I can open it. So I'm now logged into this application as JJ. And we can test this if you want by in the immediate pane hitting environ username. Oh, I am signed in as JJ. Windows thinks I'm JJ.
So that would, Andrew,
yeah,
just a question. So if you're using the function OS username function that's been out on the MVP site for years, I know people have talked about being able to spoof the environment variable.
Yeah.
Does FOS username still return your name, or does it return JJ at this point?
It would return JJ at this point because this application is running as that user.
That's great. I mean, I had never seen this run as executable mentioned before.
So this is actually quite useful. If I have a VPN to a client, I can execute from my own computer with whatever AD credentials I have on their system by using Runas.
That's pretty slick. I
use that for Management Studio as well, because my Management Studio has some add-ins installed, which I usually can't get IT to install at our client site. So sometimes I'm lucky and I get a VPN instead of just a remote desktop. And with the VPN, I can use my own Management Studio and all the good add-ins I have installed there. So let's proceed a bit with this sales example. As I said, or as I showed you, we've given select permissions on the table. So what happens if I try to update something? I get an error message that the update failed. The update permission was denied. So I'm pretty sure that you can see that even if I try to circumvent the security by using that app hacker approach I showed earlier, it wouldn't work because the user simply doesn't have the permissions at the server level. So I've just demonstrated how we can make a custom user role, how we can add people to that role, And this means that, in my opinion, in my experience, you just made good friends with IT. Because IT can now handle adding and removing users, not by going into your application, but by adding and removing them from the AD groups, which is, in my understanding, the way that IT prefers to deal with users. This means if a user is leaving the company, they strip them from the AD group, they don't have permission anymore. If a user is onboarded into, I don't know, Sales Department East, we just add them to that group, and if Sales Department East have access, then the user has access. This also means that IT doesn't need to come in and mess with my database to create the user account, and that makes me happy because I prefer to have IT, as far removed from the project as possible. So let's talk a bit more about permissions. I just glazed over it earlier. So before we proceed, let's talk about this. What is it we do when we talk about the terms rights, objects, and principals? So the basic syntax is this: grant rights on an object to a principal. Now, rights can be insert, select, update, delete, your basic CRUD statements, or it can be execute for procedures and functions. And you can try to grant select permission on a stored procedure and it will just fail. There are other permissions as well that we can grant, such as the ability to create a login or the ability to create a table, but I don't want to go there right now. So what are objects? It can be tables, views, stored procedures, even user-defined functions. It can be at the schema level, or it can even be just a single column in a table. And again, there are others that we don't mention. Finally, the principal part of it. What is a principal? It can either be a user, such as a Windows user or a Windows group. It can be a custom role. It could also be a SQL Server authenticated user, or it could be something else. But as I tried to illustrate, I would almost never grant rights directly on users. I would say an exception is when the developer, for instance, the database owner might get permissions on his user account because we don't want to create a user group just for the developer. So, we could also have applied the same select rights directly on the user, but let's also say by doing it on a role instead of doing it on the AD group, which I also could have done, then let's say we have several different groups. Instead of just having sales people, we might have sales east, sales west, sales north, sales south, whatever. And from the point of view of our application, we just want all of them to have the same user rights within our application. It might be that IT has a different reason for wanting to set up different groups. But with this setup, I just create a user for each of the AD groups and assign them all as members of the same role. And this means I don't have to have 4 sets of permissions I set up. I just set up permissions on the role 1 time and then assign the role 4 times. Now that we have our rights set up in a simple way, I just want to mention that it's also a very good idea to make sure our Access app is behaving in the same way as SQL Server. Like for a good user experience, we want to make sure that the interface adapts. For instance, whether our form has allow edits, allow additions, allow deletions set. You saw earlier that I was actually allowed to start my edit and then got an error message. And you might have noticed that the insert row was also available, even though this user doesn't have insert permissions. So if you want to make a good user experience, you should also make sure that your Access app listens to who the user is, and if it knows that this user doesn't have permission, then disallow additions. Set that to false so the user doesn't think he can do it. And if you want to know if the user is a member of a role, I have this simple VBA function, which is actually calling a SQL Server function by creating a pass-through query, passing it in my connection string, then do select its member. This is a SQL Server function. And is he a member of this role? Well, if he is, that's just a SQL. I open a record set and I take the 0 field of that and return that in my isMember, so I get a true false. So if I was to run this on my JJ user and say, well, am I a member of the sales role, then it would say yes. So let's talk on expanding a bit. I just showed you how you could grant select on that single table. But what if we want to be more granular in our permissions? What if we want to just do it at the column level? My table had sales ID, salesperson, sales amount, sales date, but it also had credit card. What if I don't want my users to be able to view the credit card details? So what I can do is I can say grant select and then specify the columns on the table sales to whichever user I want to do it to. And I can also do the same for the update statements. I can say grant update on just sales amount. So I don't want my user to be able to change the salesperson or the sales date, but they can change the sales amount. We do this by specifying the column name. So let's do a quick demo of that. So first I'm going to revoke all from table sales. Oh, I have to remember to use my Seattle database. There we go. Revoke all. Now, the user doesn't have permission anymore. So I'll go ahead and I'll grant select on table sales to role sales. And I will say he can update the sales amount. But how is this going to work from Access? Because, I mean, Access has that linked table. So let's go in and see how the Access side of things. Just close down my sales table. Try to open it up again. I get a call failed. So how am I going to work around this? It's like it gets the information that how many records there are because it did have permission on the sales ID, but it can't get the full record. So what if I created a query within Access? Oops. I'll take my sales table. I will try to take my sales table. So I say let's do all of the fields except the credit card. And let me save this. Query sales. And see how that works. So now I have permissions to select on my table, and I can use this query for my form. And as you recall, I did have update permissions. So let's test if I can update a row. I could update a row, so the update works, but I only had update permissions on this column. So what happens if, I want to steal this guy's sales? I want to say that this was actually my sale. So let's try that. The update failed. I can't steal his sales.
How about writing a new record, Anders?
Well, I didn't grant insert permissions, so I can't write a new record yet. But are you asking if it would work? So let's say grant insert on table sales to role sales. I haven't actually tried to grant insert on just some columns. I don't know if that means. But let's go down here and say this user created a record. And just try to actually hit the right row. There we go. So I could create the record. So that was column level security. What if we want users to only be able to see some of the rows in the table, not all of the rows? Row level security means that we restrict which rows the user can see, or sometimes even update. It could be that you want to restrict a hospital nurse to only be able to view the patients that are in her ward. or let salespeople view their own orders. With SQL Server role level security, this limitation is defined at the server level. So just like before, I want to have it at the server level, so it doesn't matter if the user is being clever, using an app hacker, or using Excel to connect to SQL, or using Management Studio to connect to SQL. I want to make sure that even if they do that, all they're going to see is the same thing they have permissions to see in the app anyway. So how can we implement row-level security? There's a couple of ways we can do this. We can start by using views, which is also the preferred or the only way of doing it before SQL Server 2016. So first, I'm going to revoke all the permissions on table sales. Then I'm going to create a view called view sales. And I'm going to filter it on the salesperson being the same guy as the system user. Okay, so let's go in our Access application. Here we go. And let us try to open up view sales. So this fails. Of course it does, because I didn't assign any permissions on the view. I just created it. So I'm going to grant select, insert, update, delete on my view. Let's give it another view sales. Now I'm only getting my own records out. Remember, I'm the JJ person. I can only view my own records. And I did have update permissions. So let's see. I can update my views. It's important though that when we have a view, in order to update it properly, we need to have the primary key set. So I'll just delete this for a second. And I use this code, which I've simply called add link table. And what it does is it basically does a do command transfer database, link, ODBC database, pass in my connection string, which is defined up here, say I want a table, what's the table name, which is the name being passed in, what should it be called in my Access application, I just use the same, and right now I don't even remember what the false is. Anyway, add link table, view sales. So the first time I do run this, it's going to come up and say, well, what's the unique identifier? That's the sales ID. So that was that. That was views. In SQL Server 2016 and newer, we have the security policy, row level security. So views are great, but you have to remember to use them all the time. Because I might, half a year from now, I'm creating a report and I might forget that JJ is not supposed to be able to view those rights or view the full report. He's only supposed to be able to view his own records. Or, you create one report and say, well, this isn't only for administrators, so it's fine that it selects everything from the table. And then, a couple of months later, they decide, well, salespeople should have access to it too. And you forget that this wasn't filtered by the salespeople. So with views, there's this risk of accidentally leaking information. One thing I completely forgot to mention, which I should have, was that notice how we didn't have any permissions on the sales table because I revoked those, and the user can no longer select directly from the sales table. But since he has permissions on the view, he can select through the view to the sales. So by using these views, we can also control what the user can view, see, and update. So let's go here. So for the security policy, there's a couple of things we need to do. Personally, I prefer to put my security policies in a separate schema, though you could put them in the same schema. So I'll create a new schema assigned to database owner. In this schema, I'm going to create a function call it function security salesperson. It takes in a salesperson argument, which is a varchar 20, and returns a table. It doesn't return a function or an integer or anything. It returns a table, and it just says, basically, I want to issue this select one as row visible, where salesperson equals system user. So I've created my function. This in itself doesn't do anything, it's just a function. Now I go ahead and create a security policy. So I'll give this policy a name. I'll call it sales filter. And it's a filter predicate calling my security function. It passes in salesperson, and I want this security function to act on my sales table. And what might not be obvious from this syntax is that the argument here is referring to the salesperson within the column salesperson within the sales table. So I'll execute this. Now I'm going to go ahead and grant full rights on the table. Select, update, insert, delete directly on the table, so not the view. And one more thing, I need to grant some permissions on the function. I could either grant them directly on the function, or in this case, I'm just going to grant select permissions on the entire schema. If I don't do this, we're going to get an error in Access that the user doesn't have the right to call this function. So we saw before that we couldn't open the sales table. So now we can open the table, and furthermore, it is actually being filtered by the user. So this means if I go on and create a new report, then that report is also only going to show the filtered results. This is a great way of kind of, set and forget. Now people can only view the records they should have access to at the very core table level. So you don't have to worry about that you forgot to set this anywhere, because you have it at the table level.
Can you show us again where that function is being called?
The function is being called by the security policy. That's all I did. I don't add it to a view. I don't add it to a filter clause. This is basically putting this filter predicate of calling the function, which is only returning one if the salesperson is actually the system user. So one issue is that as an administrator, I'm not the salesperson, so I can't view the table anymore. Let's see what happens in SQL Server when I write select star from table sales. Oh, there's nothing in the table. I might as well delete this table. It's obviously not being used. Yeah, I've done that once. So what can we do about that? We can make an administrator override to our security policy. You might recall this isMember I mentioned earlier. We can use that at the view level. So before we had our view that was selecting the tables from sales, where salesperson equals system user. Now I expand on this by saying or. I call isMember, and this is being called for the active connection, in this case my connection, or when I execute it from Access, it's going to be called with JJ's connection. So if I'm a member of the DB owner role, then I will also get access to view them. In the same way, we can do this for the function security salesperson. And I'm going to illustrate this now by adding this or is member of the DB owner statement to my security function. Let's see, I am the system user. And if I do now select star from table sales, I get to view this. And if we just want to have a look at this one, we'll see it returns a 1 because I am the DB owner for this database. Now there's one more thing we didn't really discuss, and that is I could only view my own rows, But let's say I have this, we had this sale that we didn't profit on. My keyboard is acting up a bit here. Let's say I don't want to have this sale assigned to me because that sale ended badly. Let's try to see if I can throw it over to JJ because I have update permissions on the full table now. So I was able to update it to match someone else. We can prevent that. For the row level security, we do this by adding a block predicate. So there's the filter predicate and the block predicate. Go ahead now, also add the block predicate to my table. And you will see now I cannot anymore update. I can update a row, but if it falls out of my filter predicate, then it's going to say, well, that's not okay. It has a block predicate. So this makes sure that I cannot edit it in a way that it makes it fall out of my permissions. In the same way for the view, we can add this view with check option, which is going to function the same way for the view we had defined here, the view sales, that if I try to edit any row so it no longer matches the criteria, then that's going to fall out as well, and it's going to give me an error. One of the things with this check option is you have to be kind of certain about your where condition, because let's say my where condition is that I have to be the sales user, but I might have also added and sales status equal open. And this would then mean that if you're looking at the view and try to change the status from open to closed, and you have with check, then that would also error. So you have to be certain about the ways you use this with check option. So sometimes it might be that we've set up our select, our permission, but we don't want to give full update on the column. We might want to say, well, you can update it, but we don't want you to update it with just any value. And again, most of the times we just put this logic in the front-end application and that is good enough. But what if our update operation is more complex? This is where we might want to implement a stored procedure instead. So what I do is I might create a view, the user select permission from the view. I'll make a temp table in Access, and whenever the user clicks that view in my Access application, I copy the information into the temp table. And I know this is a bit cumbersome, and this is only something you should consider when you really have something that you want to be absolutely certain that users can only update data in a certain way, and we want them to use the stored procedure. Or it could be that we have different phases we're going through, and you say, well, you can only update it when the whole version is open, or the whole version is the budget hasn't been closed, stuff like that you want your stored procedure to check. So I'll call a stored procedure for doing the update and doing all of that testing. And finally, since I'm using a view for browsing, I want to requery, so I return back home. Let me just give an example of how that might work. So I have a different application from my sales application. I have my employee list that is bound to my employee info view. I have a lot of people here. And let's try to update one of them. So I'll click here, and as I click here, the information is copied into a temp table, twork employee info. And this is the bonus I want this person to receive. Type in new bonus. Oh, I get an error message. This error message actually originates in SQL Server. You're not the employee's manager. So in this case, I've set up SQL Server security by using a stored procedure to say only if you are assigned as the employee's manager, you can do this. And the manager isn't at the employee level. the employee is attached to a department and the department has a manager. So I can't really set up my permissions directly on the table itself because the employee table doesn't have information on who the manager is. It's more complicated. I need to use the stored procedure for it. So let's take a quick look at how the stored procedure looks. So I have the stored procedure set employee bonus. And I pass in the ID of the employee I want to update and what the new bonus amount should be. And this is where I run a select statement where I select from the employee info for the employee ID, and the department manager has to be the user currently using the system. And if that doesn't return anything, that is then because you're not the employee's manager, and I'll do a throw. So in SQL Server, I'm throwing this error. I give it an error number, an error message, and a severity. I throw this error. That means the rest of the code is not going to run. And within SQL Server, I then have to handle this error so that we get that error message up on screen. So let's try to look at the form detail. So what happens when I'm updating the TXT bonus amount? I start my ADODB command by calling out to this server command, which is preparing my stored statement for me. And I pass it in the parameters that I want, the employee ID and the bonus amount, and I execute it. And if everything works fine, then I simply exit the sub. But in case an error is thrown it'll be thrown here on the execute statement. I go down here to the error handler and I look at the error number. And this is the error number that I will get back from SQL when I use my own error number. So this is not like the 50,001 I showed you. This is a SQL Server error. So I'll give them the message box that you couldn't perform this operation. And I'll go over at the command object I have. I will look at its active connection. And that connection has an errors collection. And I want to get the native error. So this native error, that's going to be the error number I defined in SQL Server, the 50,001. And in the same way, I'm going to get the description for that error. That's the error message I defined in SQL Server. And I'm going to post that in my message box. I'm going to cancel the update to the bonus. And I'm going to undo the bonus. So that, again, this isn't really related to SQL Server side of it. This is making sure that the interface adapts to the fact that you couldn't do the bonus. So let's try to do a bonus for someone I am actually the manager of. So let's just sort this. I will go down to Copenhagen. I missed. Where is it? There we go. Copenhagen sales. There's this swell guy. He should certainly have a big bonus. I will give him a big bonus. Oh, there was another error. Let's just try to do it like this. 10. So I could give him a bonus of 10, but I couldn't give him a bonus of 50. Why is that? Because at the server side, I actually had a second condition saying if the bonus amount is larger than this value, throw a different error and say you're not allowed to update. So in this way, we can use different error numbers in SQL. It doesn't have to be different error numbers. We could use the same error number and give a message that goes back into my Access application. This also means if you have multiple Access applications that are accessing the same tables, then we make sure they're functioning the same way by defining our checks at the server level instead of in the Access database. Another good thing is if I half a year from now decide that, it shouldn't be 20, it should be 30, I'm done. I don't have to go and release a new Access front end because it's at the server level. Any questions on this? This is probably one of the most complicated parts. So, and as I said, I definitely don't recommend doing this for everything, only for when you really need that extra level of security.
Anders, can you retrieve those SQL Server errors using a pass-through, a DAO pass-through query?
Yes.
Okay.
You can. I have some ODBC error handling information somewhere. So one of the reasons I absolutely love using ADODB is I get parameter checking. If I had to do the same with a pass-through query, it would look something like this. Exec USP set employee bonus at bonus amount equal. Okay, so now I have to parse the bonus amount. Now SQL Server is going to be expecting it in English format, but if my user is Danish, there's going to be a difference between how we use period and how we use comma for separating numbers. So this means I have to go ahead and do a format of the bonus amount, and sorry, not a format, or I could do a replace of the bonus amount, and replace commas with periods or vice versa. And if I have dates, I have to format the dates as well. But if I use this syntax, then they're going to be passed directly because I'm not first converting it to a string. What's happening down here is that you're converting it first to a string, just so you can be able to do it in a pass-through query. So
Right.
I'd much rather prefer to use ADODB. Also, if I misspell something, I'm gonna be informed that it can't find the parameter. It's not going to try to execute it with some weird random result. It's going to come up here and say, I can't find bonus amount. And my server command SP, short for stored procedure, take a quick look at that. What it does is it starts a command, and if I haven't passed in a connection, it's going to use the server connection object that we already have. But in some cases, if I want to do transaction stuff like that, I might want it to function on a different connection, which is why I have this optional parameter. I specify that the command type is a stored procedure. I pass in the procedure name, which comes from up here. Now, when I do this command parameters refresh, what it does, it goes ahead, it does a hit against SQL Server and says, let me know what parameters you are expecting. And we'll come back and say, well, I'm expecting the bonus amount, and I'm expecting that to be an integer. I'm expecting the date, and I'm expecting that to be a date time 2, or a date time, or whatever. I get all of that information by using ADODB. So that is one of the reasons I love ADODB.
ActiveDB to populate a list box?
I haven't tried, but you could. I use it to populate list boxes in Excel all the time.
So you're adding line by line. You're not binding.
So in Excel, I'm not adding it line by line. You type, and it's kind of confusing because as I recall, you type listbox.columns equals recordset.getRows or something like that. It's a bit.
Okay.
It's a while since I've done it. It's definitely like columns equal rows, or there's something about it that throws me off. So to kind of wrap up, whenever we have a new development project, what we will do is we'll ask their IT department to make sure that we have a database created on their server, and we want to have a user that has DB owner membership to the database, and if possible, we want to have a test user that has regular access to the database. So we don't need a separate machine. I just need something where I can use that run as, pass in the password, and then have a user that has that set of permissions. Now, usually we do development either on our own server and then port it to their systems, or we do it via VPN. And sometimes we do it through remote desktop or Citrix client. I gotta say, I really hate doing it through Citrix because, you can't install anything, and each time I'm in VBA and I hit Shift F2 to go to the definition of something, the whole window resizes. And I'm like, Anyways, thank you very much for listening to me for this hour of me fast talking through SQL Server security. If you have any follow-up questions, I'll be happy to assist. This is my email. If you have any questions now, I think we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, we're running over, but as far as I'm concerned, I will stay on as long as we have questions.
So Dale, I think you asked at one point if I could do this for all tables at once. I could write SQL that writes SQL to do it for all tables at once.
Okay, so you're talking about a dynamic SQL statement that basically loops through all of the tables in the in that database.
Yes.
Okay.
And you could do that, or if that's what you're after, it might be more simple to say I want to grant select on the schema. So I'll grant select on schema : DBO, and now the user can select anything from that schema. That includes views though, and functions. I think I can't remember if you grant select or execute on functions. So that might help, and the benefit of that is if you add a new table, the user will have that permission automatically since he has it on the schema.
Okay, that's useful. And with regard to column level security, can you simply do a grant deny or deny, select deny?
So one of the permissions I didn't talk about is the deny permission. So let's say we have that credit card column. So I'll start by saying grant select on the full table to salesperson. So now we can select everything. And then I'll say deny select on credit card column to salesperson. So now he cannot select that column, which, it might work because for this scenario, it might sound stupid, but let's say instead you've granted that person select permission on the entire schema and you just want to deny on this single column. The thing is, let's say we have a user who is both a salesperson but also an administrator, and we want the administrator to have full access. But if the administrator is both a salesperson and part of, let's say we have a role called role admin, and we now use deny for the salesperson, then that is going to override whatever select permission I give my administrator. So now my administrator can no longer see this credit card column. So you can use deny for certain cases, but I've always kind of felt it's going to end up causing me more trouble than it's worth. So I prefer to use the other way, but there are edge cases where you might be thinking that let's grant select on everything except for this single table. So it can be used, but as I said, then there's tricky issues if you're members of multiple roles.
So when you write a script for permissions for your database applications, are you writing a single monster script, or are you writing a whole bunch of individual scripts that relate to, I should say, SQL statements that relate to individual tables or views, and then you create a monster that says, run this SQL statement, run this SQL statement, etc.?
That's a very good question. So first off, I'll say 90% of what we do, 85% of what we do grant select, update, insert, delete on this schema to all users, or to that role and to that role, so to role sales and to role administrator. So we just do it on the full schema. That is sufficient for a lot of what we're doing. Then maybe we might be a bit more particular on some of the stored procedures. Let's say we have a stored procedure that's, loading, reading in data from Navision or another third-party system database, we might be more particular in granting the execute permission. So, but let's go back to the case of when we actually want to be very particular about what we're granting access to. I will grant access as I develop. I don't have a monster script. I will grant access as I develop, and I will check it as I develop, just like we regularly do with access. Does it work for this user? Yes, it does. Okay, I'll continue. And of course, sometimes there are things that I miss. Just like with any access application, sometimes we mess it up. But I don't have this monster script that I run and rerun, because once I've set it up, I don't need to run it again and again and again. Does that make sense?
How do you audit your script to make sure, it's set up the way you want?
So there are certain ways that you can get, there are system views that you can use to get the information. Actually, one of the things that we kind of like and have used a lot is most of the times when we have these very complicated projects, they usually also involve having multiple environments at the back end. So we have a development environment, we have a test environment, and we have a production environment. Sometimes we just have development and production. So in those cases, I use Redgate SQL compare, because the compare option is also going to list the permissions. And then I can see, I added the select permission on this table. So that kind of is where, when I deploy it to production, I'm gently reminded that, I've added this permission, which I didn't have in the last release. I added the permission to select on this table or update on this table or this column. So I kind of use that as my audit check, but there are other ways, and you can write views that list out all the permissions in different kind of ways. But it's not something I go through every week and, let me remember to audit who can edit this and that.
Okay. I spent hours yesterday trying to figure out why a user account didn't have rights when another user account did.
Yeah, so some of it is and that can actually be part of the tricky part, because permissions can be defined in so many places, or they can be denied in so many places. You can look at the object. Let's say I've granted select on the schema DBO. Well, if I then go look at the table in my database, then I can't see that which users have permissions, because it's at the schema level. So here's the security predicates I set up. Permissions. So we can see that role sales has delete insert permissions. But if this was granted at the schema level, so let's try to go and do that now. So switch to Seattle. I revoke all on table sales. So let's go ahead and check it. So there's nothing here. I shouldn't be able to select on it. But if I grant select on schema DBO to role sales. So now we are in agreement that role sales can select from the table. But if I go look here, permissions, I can't see that. I might look at this and think no one can select from the schema, but they can. Or it could be that I have altered the role data reader, and you can actually add a role to another role. So I can alter the data reader role and add the role sales to be included in the data reader, which also won't show up here, But any member of role sales can now select from the entire database, all schemas, all tables. So it can be difficult to track, which is one of the benefits, I think, of putting it at the table level, that you can, right-click it and see, well, who can actually select from this? And that's the benefit of not using data reader and not using schema level permissions.
Appreciate that.
What about naming conventions? Have you have any recommendations for? I noticed in mine I had my database login and my server login and my database user were the same name, but I get it confused.
No, I don't. If you have a lot of AD groups, it's definitely going to be simpler if you just call them the same. So I had my user, I called it salesperson, even though it came from the AD group salespeople. So you could argue that would it make more sense to call this group sales people, so that I'm more, aware that it's actually a group.
Okay.
Let me, I think I closed that down.
I thought you had some custom roles on your database.
Some custom roles?
Yeah, you're just using the built-in roles?
That's it. If I do a refresh here, you're going to see it.
Okay.
This was the role sales.
Okay.
So this was the role I created. All of these others are built-in database roles that come with the database. Now, they're always going to be there. That doesn't mean I'm using them.
Okay.
So Anders, let's go back to the Access front end. You have your sales table, and you don't want some people to be able to see the credit card, and you want others to be able to see the credit card. Mm-hmm. So you create separate views, or you create that security profiles for those users. In the Access front end, then are you checking the AD group to determine what form to display, or to assign the correct view to as a form record set?
So I will use the isMember on, let's say, role sales. So as I said, this will create that pass-through query with the connection string, pass it in the SQL, and just return whether or not I'm a member. So I could query AD groups, but I already have my database connection, so I'll just query whether they're a member of that role. That has been my approach, and I guess it doesn't really matter if you're querying AD groups or roles, but in this case, the role is tied to my application. If IT decides that Sales East shouldn't be called Sales East anymore, we're just going to call it Sales, then I think that would automatically update in SQL Server. I'm not entirely sure, but I think so. And since they're a member of the role sales, then this syntax would continue to work. But if you have syntax that is calling for the AD group name, then that would start failing. So I think this is more kind of closely integrated with your application. And it is more related to the role that we give people, because also, let's say, maybe we have an application that is for, as I said earlier, let's imagine we have 4 AD groups called Sales East, Sales West, Sales North, Sales South. And what we really just want to check is, are they a salesperson? Are they a member of the role sales? So it makes more sense to ask of their role than ask of their AD group, in my opinion.
Okay, so for example, if you have a button that says employee info, and you want to pull up the employees screen, you would do this, maybe on the form load you would do if is member role HR, then me.record source equals view employees full. If you and then else me record source is equal to view employees subset or something.
That could be one way of doing it. Sometimes we'll have different tabs, and we'll just hide some of the tabs if they're not administrators.
Okay.
Of course, there's some things that you need to be aware of, like if it's not enough to hide the tab. If the tab is there and the subform object is set at design time, then it's going to try to run the query, and if it doesn't have permission to run the query, then you're going to get an error message. So in my case, I hide the tab, or if they are administrators, I show the tab, and when they click the tab, the subform object is assigned at runtime so that I make sure I don't accidentally try to run a SQL Server select statement that they don't have permissions for. You can also do some interesting stuff with views that doesn't mean you have to necessarily have different roles for the same thing. Let's see here. Let's see, we have our view sales. And let's try to do a select from view sales. So probably one of the things I've set up is blocking me from probably the security policy right now. Okay, so now I can see all of the records. But let's say I can do like this, say case so when the salesperson is the system user, show the sales amount, otherwise show null. And as sales amount. So see, when I do this, so now my view is dynamically changing to not show just a single column. So it's still there, but I'm only actually going to be able to see it when I'm this user. So let's try to do this execute as user equal JJ. I think I deleted that user. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's what I was. That's kind of what I was thinking was to use a case statement in the credit card, along with the credit card, and say if the
So
I mean,
you might do it like this, and then in your access front end, you might say, well, if I open a record that I'm allowed to view, then show all of the columns. And if I open a record that's not my own, then I'm going to take that column sales amount and I'm going to set the width to 0 so that they don't even see the null. They're just, I can't see that.
Right. Yeah, that's okay, great. I appreciate it. Anybody else have any other questions? This has been a great session, Anders. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
If you could send me at least your PowerPoint briefing. And I don't know, the Access database won't do any good without the SQL Server stuff.
No.
So.
But I'll send a zip file, and that zip file actually has all of the scripts used, including the one that I think it actually resets the entire database, including creating it. So you can create it on your own.
That would be great. And then I'll post that out onto today's meeting site on the Access Users Group site, and update the LinkedIn announcements to let people know that it's there, and then also I'll do the same with the video as soon as it's available.
Yep. Sounds good.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you very much, Anders, and thanks for everybody who showed up today. Giorgio, I see you joined us.